Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame any way we can. We want to get like our baseball bats and just beat up sexual shame. That's what we want to do. In particular, sexual shame. There's lots of different types of shame, but that's one that we definitely talk about a lot on this show. And I'm really thrilled to have Allison Shiffler with me today. She's a colleague and a peer here in the state of Utah, practicing as a therapist. And I've worked with her briefly before and presented with her, different places where we're presenting at the same time. And it's just been lovely to hear her talk. And I think she has a lot of really great things to say and a lot of great insights in regards to our topic today, given where and how she practices. So without further ado, Allison, I'd love to give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
Sure. So my name is Allison. I'm currently practicing for my own practice, which I recently started, and is always a very exciting step. So I'm currently doing individual and couples therapy and have some plans of moving a little bit more directly into couples therapy, which is funny because in grad school that was so intimidating and so scary. And I kind of attribute it to maybe my ADHD of like more things to think about and connect. And I love it. I love working with couples. But previously I was, so I've been in private practice for the last 3 years, going on 4 years this year. And prior to that, I was working in forensics, which is an interesting description of doing social work, clinical social work. But I was working for the Utah State Hospital with severe persistent mental illness, specifically with incarcerated men. So first jump out of grad school was getting into, a lot of severity. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity because it was incredibly educational. Prior to that, in my grad school experience at Columbia University, I worked with members and family members of the military, where I worked for the Stephen R. Cohen Military Family Clinic. And prior to that, I was a intern high school counselor at 2 different high schools in Harlem, where I was learning a lot about school funding, especially in areas of severe marginalization. Prior to that, my bachelor's work, I was working in residential treatment as well as employed for the state of Utah for DCFS, working with severely neglected and abused children, as well as parents who were working toward permanency and assisting them with the services they needed. So been all over the place in terms of my social work experience, but lately really landing on couples and individuals and loving this work, especially with what we're going to talk about today in identifying how much shame, especially in the area of, sexual trauma or areas of sexual repression and how that affects an individual in various aspects of their life.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, I love hearing your background. That gives us a sense of like the scope, of diversity of folks and situations that you've practiced under. And I never see any issue that isn't affected by some type of sexual shame, because that starts at the core of such young versions of ourselves typically. And so how that impacts our roles and our ideas about self, and then how we interact with family and systems such as, even criminal systems and family systems and all that. So really fascinating. How did you end up here in Utah? Do you mind telling us just a little bit about your personal background, or because it sounds like you were out east and
Of course. So born and raised in Pennsylvania, I was actually the first person in my family to be born into Mormonism. My mom converted when she was in her 30s, and all of my brothers were little boys while the missionaries were teaching my family over and over and over again. Took my mom a while to convert. And so I was raised in Mormonism, and in 2005, I came out to Utah to go to, at the time, Utah Valley State College, now UVU, and started out in humanities. Now, I kind of want to pause for a minute because I've said this many times where people are like, you came out to Utah to go to UVSC? And in my mind, in my very, very, very Mormon, gender rolled mind, I just thought, well, I'm really just coming out here to get married. To me, education was presented kind of as an insurance plan of like, you need to go to college in case your husband dies. Like, that's just kind of an important thing to do. We've healed since that, and the career is going well and feeling really happy about where I'm at. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my mom gave me a lot of really, empowering language as well. But that is why I came out to Utah to go meet a Mormon boy and get married, but also at the same time go to school, Right. So yeah, moved out here in 2005, was always living south of BYU campus and was in singles wards for about a decade. So yeah, that's what brought me out to Utah, basically being Mormon and having that linear view of the only important thing is getting married and going to events and going to singles activities and making sure I'm at the right place at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually very common. You see people here in Utah that really comes from all over the United States in particular, and even international students who I think have similar ideas. They want to go to school with people like them. They want to partner with people like them. I mean, you see this a lot in insular religions, is that this idea that, we want to stay within the community and those things really matter to us. So yeah, a lot of those gender messages that we get for sure, especially as women. And that's been in the news a lot here recently as well.
Right.
With the Relief Society president talking about her career choices and how that's a bit different as far as how she went about her decisions as to how we are usually told to make our decisions as Mormon women, Latter-day Saint women. So
well, and it's funny because it became a little bit of a life plot twist. I started out in humanities, got my associates in humanities, which I loved. I love everything that humans do to create. And after I got my associates, I went on my mission to Russia, which is honestly where I kind of veered into social work and having this understanding that everybody's going through it. Everybody is walking around with pain and with trauma. And, there's a whole backstory as to like my little 21-year-old mind conceptualizing that. But it was funny because in my 20s, I always kind of saw that as a failure of like, oh, I'm still not married. I'm 23, I'm still not married. I'm 24, I'm still not married. And, now I'm 37 and I look back and think, oh my God, thank God I didn't get married during those times where I got to, focus on my education, not to imply that there was a right or wrong path, but now I'm very ironically grateful for staying in my education by default of not getting married in my 20s because, it led to something that did end up being really, really fulfilling. When you love what you do, it is fulfilling,
Yeah, that's amazing.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
Are you comfortable sharing any information as far as where you're at now, as far as spirituality, religion, your relationship with Mormonism, etc.?
Yeah, of course. So I resigned from the church in 2018. And to be honest, it was like many processes, it was a sequence of events. I would say one of the main events in my life was being in disciplinary councils after my mission for having premarital sex with my boyfriend at the time. And that was very emotionally traumatic, which is something that I could not label at the time. I could not identify that as a traumatic process. But, when you're a young woman who is being, for lack of a better word, treated like a perpetrator, treated like there's something wrong with you when you're just having like consensual sex with your boyfriend at age 24, 25, 26. This went on for years. And part of the emotional damage, I think of that book, The Miracle of Forgiveness, of how when you read that book, you just think, oh my God, if I don't confess everything, I'm going to go to hell. And with the setup of a disciplinary council, you are very much put in a position of needing to feel shame, needing to feel severe guilt, like needing to get the point across that you did something really, 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 really wrong. And this might sound a little bit funny now, but it wasn't funny at the time. I remember having this negative mantra in my mind, like, I'm worse than Charles Manson. I am. And that was like a real thing that I thought over and over again as a mid-20s, college girl, that like, I am such a bad person. Like, why do I keep doing this? And, with what I know now, like, well, I was a young woman with a libido and enjoyed having sex with my boyfriend. And that was it. Like, that's the story. That's it. But being in these half circles, having multiple disciplinary councils, because again, this was after my mission. So I was in doubt. I was breaking a very, very, very big rule that is often contextualized as next to murder. It is just such a horrible sin, and again, in this context of like, okay, having consensual sex with my boyfriend is next to murder. But of course, it's the emphasis of breaking covenants. And that was one of the first moments that I felt it in my bones, like felt in my body, like, this isn't okay. This is wrong. And I even remember telling my mom about it, who's very devout LDS, and seeing her affect, like seeing her concern of, they said, what? Like, they asked you what questions? Because it got pretty invasive, and I'm very comfortable saying perverse. I mean, I think it's a really, really awful thing that we do to people, women, men. I mean, I'm tempted to say women especially, but then also understanding, like, no matter who's sitting in that chair, that's an awful and degrading experience to be on this council of deciding how good you are and whether or not you get a calling and whether or not you get to be inside the temple. So that was a really awful experience. And I guess what I'm emphasizing is that part of my intuition, it wasn't about the adversary or the spirit. It was just my body saying, like, I don't want to keep doing this. I don't want to keep meeting with the bishop every week to tell him if I've been good or not. I don't, like, this doesn't feel right. And the thing that was the big turning point for me, fast forwarding years later when I became a mom in 2016 to a little girl, was, that vicarious understanding that we often have as parents, which is imagining what we've been through and now imagining your kid go through that. Mm-hmm. And even though I have like a baby, a literal baby at the time, I'm thinking to myself, if my girl as a 23-year-old, 24, it doesn't matter what age she is, imagining her in that half circle of men made me like more rageful than any thought I'd ever had in my life. So that was a big turning point for me. And right around the same time, I had listened to the interview with Joseph L. Bishop. And to be honest, that was it for me. That was when quitmormon.org was still a very quick resignation process without the formality of a notary. I'm very grateful for that. I still actually I should send that lovely attorney a donation at this point in my life, because I couldn't then. But that was a very quick decision that was not at all impulsive and was absolutely my intuition saying, I don't want her name on these records. And even though she hadn't been blessed, but I just thought, I don't want this church to track her in any way, because I don't want her to ever think that is okay. That confessing to a man or being in a half circle of men or going along with this. And the reason I went along with it was obedience. Like, I've gotten that question before of like, why didn't you just lie to your bishop? Why didn't you just, I was a good Mormon. I was like, for the most part, I was a rule follower. So, you look back on that stuff and I don't know, I'm proud of my, what I thought was rebellion at the time. I'm proud of my self-determination. One of the most important components of going to therapy is getting in touch with your intuition and knowing what's good for you, knowing what you need, knowing what the answers are, not necessarily because of what was taught to me about, the spirit. But, I also think that can be included of just learning to trust yourself and learning to know what is actually healthy for you. So that intuition became louder and louder over time of, this is too big for you to control. This is too big for you to find your own autonomy and self-love. This is just something that I don't want in my life anymore.
Yeah, so many things that you just said that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. This is I mean, first of all, I just want to thank you and thank anybody who is in a position like we are in the mental health field when you are willing to share what are very personal, private moments, right? So even just saying something like I had premarital sex. I mean, I remember when I first started talking about that from my own experience as a therapist and working within this intersection of, religious folks and post-religious folks and all the folks in between. And that's a risk. It's a risk. It's a risk to be personal like that. It's a risk to let people know details like that about your life. And yet, in my experience, that's what makes therapists like you very approachable and very real. And then people feel safe because they've had similar experiences. And for the people who maybe don't choose you because of those types of disclosures, maybe they can find another fit, because there's definitely plenty of therapists who are not disclosing those kinds of details, or who maybe they themselves did follow protocols, of their religious backgrounds. And so I just think that it's so important for people to hear other people, especially those who maybe have a little bit more power through expertise or through education, to say, hey, this happened to me. It's not just a story I talk about people in general. This is actually personal. I have personal experience with this. And I think especially for women who come from conservative religious cultures, it's so important to hear other women who say, I actually enjoyed sex. I had sex. I wanted to have sex. Yes, I went through all the guilt and the processes of that, but I had a good sexual experience with a person I at the time loved or felt connected to. It's not always that way. I mean, sometimes we have sex that isn't that great, but we're still learning and we're still figuring out, what we want in life. That's part of the developmental process. But like you, I too had sex, with a boyfriend. It was actually a very wonderful experience, except for all the ruining of my context at the time, right? That's what ruined my initial sexual experiences, not my boyfriend, not coercion, not pressure, not peer pressure, not all these things that we hear. It was really my feeling that I was doing something horrifically wrong and that I was damning myself, that. And when you talk about obedience, because my never mo boyfriend asks me that all the time, like, why do you all not just say, yeah, sure, I don't masturbate, or sure, I'm not having sex? It's like, because I think what people don't understand is that we're not really having a relationship with the bishop or with the stake president or with the mission president. We're having a relationship with what we feel is God, the divine. And God is there 24/7, and God knows already. You can't lie to an ever-seeing, ever-knowing, entity. And so if you lie to your bishops and your stake presidents to protect yourself, now you're doing two things wrong, right? Which God can still see. So there's this idea that you're going to lie is not really very beneficial, if you really take seriously this idea that the only reason you're going through a confession process to begin with is to get right with God. And you can't live your life correctly unless you do that. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And there, I try to get to that point in life of not having super heavy regret. I just try to take that existential view of whatever, all of these trillions of variables in my life have led me here. I'm happy with it. But, there is that part of me that wishes I could say to that 23-year-old, 24-year-old girl, don't answer. Just lie about it. It's fine. Just lie. And what's funny is I actually have a very specific memory of telling my bishop as a teenager in my home ward. And I don't know, I must have been like 15 or 16 years old, and it's a temple interview. Like, is there anything you need to tell me? And I said to my bishop as a teenager, I said, sometimes I lie to my parents. And he looks at me as if I told him I'm committing first-degree felonies. He goes, you lie to your parents? And I'm like, whoa. Yeah. What I mean is, like, for example, I'm the only girl and my dad's really overprotective. And so I told him I was going to the movies with a bunch of girlfriends, but it was 2 guy friends. I'm like, nothing happened. Just, I have guy friends too. And he's just like, you lie to your parents. So, that was kind of, core memory coming up right now of just like, that was a big lesson for me of, it is so important to tell the truth. It is so important as you're in this very insulated bishop's office, you better tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's a part of me that wishes I were I don't know, maybe that I didn't take it that seriously, and how much more protected I would be, ironically, if I just did not give full veracity in all of those interviews. I wouldn't have felt as much shame. I wouldn't have felt as much shame. And not that I wanted to like numb myself to the physical effects of telling lies. So again, I'm not like holding any regret there, but oh my goodness, telling the truth to an authority that had total control over my worthiness, my ability to publicly say the prayer in front of everyone in Sunday school. It's a really humiliating experience to be disfellowshipped, or to go through those formal processes. So yeah, there's that part of me that's like, oh honey, just don't tell them. You don't need to tell them. You don't need to answer that question. You don't need to tell him if it was over the clothes or under the clothes. You don't need to answer whether or not he ejaculated. Just don't answer any of it, but here we are healing, and with that healing, especially in this clinical context of my life, having a lot of understanding. I don't regret that. I don't regret the understanding and I guess those direct experiences, those lived experiences as clinicians. That's not necessarily always the reason we do this work, but it certainly does help. In fact, it's funny. It's not a normal thing for a clinician to, as you said, give some areas of like our self-disclosure. We've got to be really careful about that, especially in therapy sessions. But also in the very beginning of my private practice career, if I had a nickel for every time someone would pause in an intake session, kind of scan my tattoos and say, sorry, do you know what seminary is? Do you know? And I'm like, oh, okay, let me give you a real quick rundown. I went on a mission to Russia. I have always been a Relief Society president or gospel doctrine teacher. And, this is the part that I don't always say, but like my temple name is tattooed right here, and it's also my cat's name. So I'm not in the church. And then I usually give a little disclaimer of, I support anybody's path of doing what is safe and healthy for them. Whatever that is, we're just going to be very honest about whether or not it's healthy. And that's why we're here. So there is no polarity or anti anything with regard to what a person chooses within the honesty of their self-determination. So disclaimer, everyone's safe in my office. But yeah, we're going to get down to our own personal truth and, again, self-determination of what living a healthy life looks like.
Yes, right. No, thank you for that. And it is this kind of balancing act, because it's, I think both of us can probably say we spent a lot of time and energy and effort loving our community. And it's not that we're always here to say, oh, religion in general is unhealthy, or, certain cultures, but whether it's family or religion or government, there are dynamics that can be healthy or unhealthy. And that's true of really any system that we come from. And so, but I think sometimes when you come from more insular religions in particular, or high demand religions, it's very hard to have those conversations without feeling like you are unfaithful, right? And the system itself really does not tolerate critique. And that's unhealthy, right? So it's not that the religion as a whole is unhealthy. It's these processes, that if we could hopefully tweak a little, we could get healthier within these organizations as well, in these systems. So one thing is, you mentioned the LDS endowment. Not everybody who listens to this podcast is LDS. And so I just want to say that in the Latter-day Saint tradition, when and if you go to the temple, which is different than going to church, you make covenants and promises. And that's when people take on the temple garment, which is the clothing that Latter-day Saints wear as a religious kind of sense of worship. And so you're held to a higher standard as a member of the church once you've been through that process. And therefore, if you've had sex or done other things that you're going in to confess to, you're usually going to be treated with more disciplinary kind of results from that than if you had not gone to the temple. So I just wanted to clarify that what you were referring to earlier. Yeah.
It's on one hand, it's like a step of orthodoxy, like I remember when I was living in New York, I found myself explaining Mormonism a lot. And someone said, okay, so it's like the really, really dedicated members. I said, yeah. And also in the Mormon beliefs, it's a step to getting to heaven. It's a requirement for being in like the highest kingdom with Heavenly Father, so it's not just this like optional thing. It's like the inevitable goal for everyone.
Right. Yes. And I think you made a really interesting point that I've made throughout so many years, is that those who take these things more seriously trend to have more shame, which is kind of this really ironic, sad kind of aspect of it, right? Like I kind of tease that the teenagers who are rolling their eyes at their teachers, who are talking about masturbation being really naughty behavior or something. Sadly, those are the kids that trend to be healthier later in life. They didn't take it as seriously. Whereas the kids who are like, their eyes are wide open, listening to their leaders, and they're like, oh my goodness, maybe I'm doing something really bad here. I better go figure this out. Those are the people who really end up struggling more. So it's just so sad and ironic that the more devoted members, especially in youth processes, when they're going through those developmental processes, are going to internalize sexual shame more than others. And that's true regardless of the ability.
No, and I love that you said that, because I feel like, with many of my clients, that is a point of compassion that I really feel the need to make, because, sometimes in therapy, we can be really, really, really hard on ourselves about the pace of our process. And I think sometimes that validation is really, really needed, especially if, I don't know, you come from a general authority family and it's taking a while to get to this point of, like wearing the sleeveless shirt or having the coffee maker out whenever family members come over, or like, it's taking me so long to get to this point where I just don't care what people think. And I will often come in pretty hot with, let's talk about where you were. Let's talk about what those expectations were in your family. Let's talk about how perfectionism was the rule. Like you had to be perfect all the time, the way that your family had to present. And I'm not just specifying, general authority families, but just like the culture of an individual's LDS family and how high the demands were. So yeah, like the resilience is still there. Absolutely. But it's okay for that meiosis to take some time, as there's a lot to unlearn. And especially if that aspect of shame or, holy shit, I'm really disappointing them. Like it's not this light switch of, I don't care, I'm going to get a neck tattoo. It's not a slow process. I sometimes have this little joke that, I don't necessarily disclose this in my sessions all the time, but I'm a youngest child. And so I always wonder, like, is that why it was, maybe a little easier for me in some regard of, I kind of had that nature of like, yeah, whatever, I'm probably disappointing them anyway. Or like, I remember saying to my mom as a little girl, I don't think I'm going to make it to the celestial kingdom. That just seems really, really hard. And she was like, but that's where I'm going to be. And I want to be with you there. And I'm like, that seems so hard. I feel like I'll probably be in one of the other ones. But don't get me wrong. I was still like on the path and dedicated. But, as I look at the direction of my life, I think, I don't know. I just kind of examine little variables. My dad was not a member. I grew up smelling coffee every single morning of my life. There were 5 LDS people in my high school. It was not a really huge part of the culture. Still went to Trek, still went to girls' camp, still had to go to all the things. But I also think it's important for us to, frankly, get into analysis brain and understanding where we came from, both geographically and within our family, and what those expectations were for us. Whether you're LDS or any other high demand religion, anything that would put us on this path of, hey, this is taking some time. This is unraveling a lot in terms of these formative years where our brain is forming, our psyche is forming, our expectations for life are forming. And there's a lot to unlearn there. There's some deep pain there for a lot of us.
Yeah. Well, in the sense of safety, we're all pack animals. And I think sometimes we have this idea that we shouldn't care what anybody else thinks. I'm like, I don't think that's very normal. I think that's sociopathy. If you really don't care what anybody thinks, that's a problem. Yeah. So we're all, I think we do need to get less caring about what some people think and get more resilient and more differentiated. But it is a pretty normal thing to care if your whole community is going to see you as deceived or as lost or as evil or as a sinner, that's going to hit as a pack animal for sure. Yeah. So you talked about, lying to your parents. You talked about, of course, having sex as a 24-year-old with a consensual partner. These are like developmentally normal things, right? When you start looking at what's developmentally normal for 11-year-olds, what's developmentally normal for 15-year-olds, right? What's developmentally normal for emerging adults. And one, sexual exploration is right up there, from touching your own body to starting to have sexual thoughts, to start having maybe romantic or sexual interests, to be curious. Those things start very early, touching your own body can start from in the womb, so it's right. And then even lying and pushing limits and trying to figure out your own ideas. I mean, those are very teenage developmental things. And this is one of the things that I think we really need to face is that high demand, high cost religions do not allow for normative development. It's like normal development is considered sinful. Right. And so people are from a very young age put at war with normal aspects of themselves. And I've been challenged a little bit because I call this abuse. To tell a young person that to touch their own body is akin, to a sin only second to murder is, in my view, a psychological sexual abuse that you are now imposing upon another individual. And of course, that makes it difficult for us as therapists because we're supposed to also value people's religious beliefs and religious or cultural beliefs, and things like that. But we have, of course, cultural beliefs that, here in the United States, for example, even the most Orthodox Christian person might not understand why in other countries we allow for female circumcision, which is a pretty barbaric thing. And people would be like up in arms saying, well, that's abusive. But then we can't look at our own abusive ways of interacting with our children, which oftentimes comes from a very protective stance. Parents, I don't think usually are wanting to abuse their children by teaching them these ideas. They really think they're being protective and helping them have better lives and Christian lives. And yet we are imposing so many issues from, like you're saying, a young age. Then we'll talk about maybe some of the ramifications of adult sexuality.
No, absolutely. And when you brought up that point about just that very example of shaming a child in that moment with the intentions of, redirecting them and ending these behaviors of masturbation, I believe that parents generally have good intentions in their mind. They're thinking this is wrong. They shouldn't do that. I don't think they're intending to be abusive, but hell yes, it's abusive. Right. And to give some contrast to that, what this sounds like in the way that is informed and educated and positive is, hey, we're not going to do that, out in the living room, but you can do that in the bathroom with the door closed. You can do that in your room with the door closed, with no one else around. It's okay. Just like that gentle voice of kind of course correcting and these are the boundaries and there's nothing wrong with that, as opposed to, this literal or metaphorical slap of the hand. Don't do that, which often comes with the message of feeling gross or feeling perverse. And we're talking about, psychologically speaking, this isn't a natural part of human development, but we are putting it in this, almost criminal mentality of, oh, I don't want them to be a sexual perpetrator. I don't know where our mind goes as parents within our very conservative culture and frankly, broken education system. I think that's the answer, which is we have not normalized this in this country. We have not made this a normal practice. And in fact, we've taken legislative action, especially in Utah, and saying there's a way to talk about this in school and there's a way that you're not allowed to talk about this in school. And oh my goodness, what would it be like if we just ascended to the predominant mentality of masturbation's great and it's healthy and wonderful, and we just need to help our kids understand the boundaries around it and what safety looks like and what inappropriate behavior looks like and what appropriate behavior looks like. I'm intentionally using this light parental voice as I talk about this because, oh my goodness, it is so damaging to promote that aspect of shame. And especially in, again, going back to the LDS church, what that looks like in the gendered separated rooms of little boys and little girls is everybody loses. In young women's, little girls are given this message of cover yourself up, otherwise you can be tempting. Walking pornography made waves as a phrase when I was a teenager. Walking pornography, you could be walking pornography. Now as a sex positive person, I'm like, hey, that's fine. But and then little boys are told you're gross. This is perverse and this is sinful and this is gross. And so, one of my whole things with patriarchy is everybody loses. When we are putting people into these oppressing mentalities of feeling like they're doing something wrong, when this is just, your natural tendency to explore what you're wearing, or wear a sleeveless shirt, or wear a 2-piece bathing suit. Nothing's threatening about that when you really stop and think about it. And when you are a teenage boy who is exploring your body, and doing that safely and figuring things out, and maybe, going to a parent who you can trust and talking about, like, theoretically, this can all go so well. It can be so safe. It can be so healthy. But shame is very emotionally traumatizing because of the repercussions that follow those moments where we first felt shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we're getting some comments from listeners. Mark says, absolutely, 100%. Scott saying everyone loses, such a good line, right? I mean, like, these are, Gwen is saying my heart goes out, so relatable to when you were talking about your own story. So it's, people resonate with these because I think at the heart of it, we all went through this. We all were sexually shamed. Our parents were sexually shamed.
Yeah.
We inherited that sexual shame from them. So many of our organizations still contribute to to sexual shame, systemic sexual shame, whether it's our school systems, our church systems, or even our legislative systems. There's something very scary for people about just allowing people to be their sexual selves. That this is something that's very fear-based in our country, for probably a myriad of reasons, right? But so let's talk a little bit then. Let's move towards kind of what are you noticing? How does this sexual shame then kind of exhibit itself as we work with people once they've, entered adulthood, once they are usually partnered or trying to become partnered or dating? What are some of the themes that you're starting to be like, hold on a minute, like, why do we see so much of this?
Yeah. I want to start with men for a minute. And I want to give the disclaimer of, like, I am a very feisty, fiery, angry feminist. I work in a very, female specific workspace. I love being a woman. I love working with women. Some of my most beautiful moments in life have been when congregating with women. I'm very much a female energy person. I love women so much. But I do want to talk about, as we navigate discussions about patriarchy, it is so important to understand what this looks like in a society when we do not normalize, the sexual shame, the child sexual abuse, all of the things that boys and men experience, and how that pans out in society. So where my mind first goes is domestic violence. Domestic violence, for those of us who, took a DV class in our MSW program, or, what have you, whether it was a documentary or a movie that kind of opened our eyes to, we have a huge issue with domestic violence in this country. And I'm going to say on this planet, but in this country, it's, one of the leading causes of death for women to die at the hand of their violent partner. So just to put that out there, that's an incredibly huge problem. And often one, especially, is really difficult to navigate because so often women are blamed for being in that relationship or, remaining in that relationship, when it is so incredibly complex as to what it looks like to leave a relationship like that. And I also want to pause and say, there is hope. And if you find yourself in a relationship like that, to please seek help, to, not allow secrecy to remain in your life, but to open up to people that you can trust. to make a plan of safety for a place that you can stay. I'm just very, very passionate, not only for my personal experience of being in a domestic violence relationship, but also just recognizing, as I've learned more about it, how unbelievably common it is. So also noting that gender is actually a really, really important part of that discussion, as many abusers, whether it is, physical abusers, sexual abusers, are trauma survivors, or in the criminal justice system, trauma victims. However, if we are talking about a group of men who perpetuate violence, and instantly we have the black and white rage of like, oh, I hate them. But let's also acknowledge that that is a population of unhealed people. Something that I learned a lot about, especially in working with members of the military and family members of the military, is that there is a lot of sexual trauma experienced by individuals in the military. I watched the documentary, The Invisible War, that was very eye-opening about that, and especially how incredibly difficult it is to report military sexual violence, because so often and so common, it is your next chain of command that you would need to report to, and very often that is your perpetrator. So just to take some certain groups. So I'm going to military. I also want to go into Boy Scouts of America, very, very, very large group of people. I rewatched the documentary last night, Leave No Trace. And I even wrote down the number of 80,000 cases were reported of sexual abuse in the Boy Scouts of America. And something that I want to make a point to say is that's what's reported.
Yeah.
And we don't have any more numbers than that, but with something associated with shame, something associated with stigma, something that is really hard for people to even say out loud, we're automatically, hopefully all on the same page of that's not the accurate number. It's more than that. Yeah. But that's what's reported, right? And so same with military sexual violence, same with, reports of rape, same with the Catholic Church. The numbers there were 330,000, and 80% of those victims and survivors were boys. Again, that's what was reported. Those were the individuals who picked up their phone and made a phone call, during that time of the Boston Globe exposing the story. So that is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, just in terms of furthering our understanding that the reported numbers, when they are high, we've got to pause and say, okay, but it's much bigger than that. So what I'm getting at here is the repercussions of trauma, as children, and especially, again, going to young boys and men who have not been socialized to, generally speaking, throughout history, be open about their emotions, to cry, to grieve, to talk about vulnerability with other boys. There's a really, really, really beautiful documentary called The Mask You Live In. I'm going to say it again. Please, everybody watch it. The Mask You Live In. And it is all about how this toxic socialization of men and boys to man up, don't be a pussy, just this whole idea of being a man usually equates to violence or anger or, just a power dynamic. And what is that really about? That's really about pain. That's really about maybe symptoms of depression, maybe about trauma that a boy or a man does not want to actually say out loud. But again, going back to those numbers, the reason I wrote down the Boy Scouts numbers, the Catholic numbers, just in 2023, there were over 7,200 cases of military sexual trauma reported. These numbers are huge. And when we polarize our, feminist discussion of men are the problem, as a clinical professional, I'm also going to jump in and say, right, we've got to make a space for people to heal. Because I think the fact is, so many people are walking around metaphorically bleeding internally, trying to just shut out the memories of what happened to them as a kid, or just shutting out the memories of things that are just horrific and dark. I think of like the cave metaphor, if you've ever gone hiking and, seen a cave, and it's kind of scary to have this cave where there's no light, there's no illumination. You literally don't know what's in there. You don't know if a bear is in there. And on a side note, yeah, I choose the bear, obviously. But anyway, making this space for, it is so scary to go into our trauma. It is so scary to say these things out loud that we just wish didn't happen. And I also want to make a compassionate space for acknowledging that we can heal. And that is one of the most beautiful things about how we are made, how we are created, how our physiology works, that with our neuroplasticity, with our meiosis, we can absolutely heal. And so far, I have not found any evidence that we can push this down like a beach ball underwater, that we can just buckle our arms throughout the whole, entirety of our lives and just be okay and just, somehow laser zap that trauma from our lives. Like, we've got to acknowledge it. We've got to talk about it. Something that I love so much in this book, What Happened to You, I have it right here, it's right here, by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, is something that Dr. Perry says is, the way that we navigate and heal from our trauma is connection. So it can actually be really, really healing to be in a safe and healthy relationship. It's incredibly healing to go to therapy where you are safe and where you are not judged and where you can talk about these things as a part of the human experience. We don't have to turn away from our trauma or see it as the darkness of a cave that is too scary to go into. We can absolutely heal. However, and, in summary of my little tangent right now, when we don't heal, it doesn't just go away. And again, with most violent perpetrators of physical abuse, perpetrators of sexual abuse, sexual violence, there is predominantly a story there of abuse and trauma that they have not navigated, they have not healed from, that they have not looked at, they have not said out loud.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I mean, this is what the term, male toxicity culture is about, right? And I think a lot of times with feminist theory and feminist ideas, there is this kind of misunderstanding that it's anti-men, right?
Yeah.
That somehow men are the problem. And I think there are people who talk about it that way, but I think when you're looking at it more systemically, and when we're talking about these kinds of terms, especially from the social science fields, what we're saying is like, no, this is a systemic problem. Everybody is damaged by it. When you have anybody who is emotionally suppressed, who does not have capacity or permission to express themselves, then everything that goes underground, all that shame, really then breeds secrecy, and that secrecy breeds what I call leakiness, right?
Yeah.
So things start leaking out. So, and whether that leaks out in violent outbursts, whether that leaks out in betrayal through secrecy, like infidelity, or, those kinds of things in relationships, this is all due to some sort of shame and trauma response of, self-protection. Like, how do we protect ourselves, which is so instinctual, while also trying to remain part of the group, which is also so instinctual. And immediately you've got a tension there that is almost just, it's so difficult for so many of us. So yes, I think these are the conversations we need to be having. And I think, even with this recent speech that this Kansas City Chiefs young emerging adult himself, Harrison Butker, I think he's 28 years old, gave, which was very traditional, very condescending to women, and then I see the response to that, like his merchandise is actually up. His merchandise is actually up right now. I'm seeing this, with a lot of like politics that we see, things that, 30 years ago, I would have thought, would have ruined somebody's political career. No, now it's actually enhancing somebody's political career to act in these kinds of toxic masculine ways that I think speaks to this underbelly in of sickness in our culture, where men are so scared to give up this idea of, this kind of masculine gendered, I'm supposed to be invincible. I'm supposed to be tough. I'm supposed to be strong. That's such a scary thing to give up, because your whole survival is based on that from, the messages you got from when you were a little boy, that instead of these people being called out and said, no, that's not Correct. That's harmful. That's harmful. What you just said is harmful. People actually will support it because they themselves are also in that space of deep fear and trauma and hurt.
Right. Well, and just like that personal insecurity, I hope this doesn't sound uneducated or cliche, but yeah, when someone is so insistent on a power dynamic, and like I was saying previously, I think that's often, about some aspect of trauma or shame or there's something going on there. If someone is consistently violent with partners, there's something going on there. If someone is pretty persistent in, how horribly they treat people or children, that's where I go, what's that about? There's something going on there. But then also acknowledging that, yeah, that's a big part of personal insecurity. So for everyone clicking on that merch, for everyone who's like, yeah, my question is, sit with that for a minute. Why does that feel good? Why does that feel good to agree with something that is so obviously a real dumbass power dynamic that is not in any way or shape or form benefiting society? The big plot twist of feminism is everybody wins. Everybody wins, more representation of women in the medical field or the law field, whatever, more financial independence for women, stimulating the economy more, everybody wins, whenever we are all healthier. There doesn't need to be this weird primal power dynamic. Hunter and gatherer societies were completely equal in terms of how they supported each other with regard to gender. So what's that about? If somebody needs to feel any relief in that moment of like, okay, good, I'm gonna go out and make the money, and it's gonna be about my status, and which again, like whatever a person, and especially a woman, chooses to do is her empowerment, as it is her choice and her self-determination of, this is what I want to do, no matter what it is. But obviously being told what to do, I don't care if you're a man or a woman, not super validating and not super empowering. And especially just this weird juxtaposition of he's literally at a graduation commencement, which is not only men. So thanks for this weird ass speech about where I'm supposed to be as I'm about to accept my diploma. Like, just everything about it's laughable and really sad. Yeah.
Again, things that I would have thought would have been ridiculous are just having so much clout, which I think speaks to this, even the emerging generations right now, of young teenagers and kind of the ideas. And we're seeing kind of a backfire effect with some, especially with young men, with these kinds of role models or influencers who are speaking to these kinds of toxic masculinity type of traits. And it's very scary and concerning. So from a sexual space, as far as people navigating their sexuality, what are you noticing there that is problematic?
Well, so I want to stay on this discussion about, men and boys and how they are socialized to be tough, man up, not express vulnerability. And because that's still a thing, right? It is still a thing that we really need to focus on what that healing looks like for everybody. A very, very, very close friend of mine, I actually, I met him in the MTC, and then our lives blossomed into leaving the Mormon church. I eventually came out as a bi woman. He came out as a gay man. And he's told me very specifically about experiences that he's had in Salt Lake City. And he's lived, in various places in the US. But in Salt Lake City, especially as, a gay man who's very out, very open, very comfortable with himself after going through a long, period of time of trauma, hating himself, suicidality. He's been through a lot to get to where he is now. But something that he has noticed about his, sexual exploration, especially in Utah, is the very large number of men who are in still a very self-loathing place while exploring sexuality. And I'm saying exploring in a very optimistic way, and I'm not at all implying that it's always in a very, healthy or honest context. And the example I want to give there is, my friend has told me it has happened countless times where he will be interacting with somebody And, maybe my friend doesn't respond to a, Grindr DM, or maybe they don't see each other again. And so often the conversation will turn to, very aggressive and almost violent hate speech of, using the derogatory F word toward a gay man. Right. So like two gay men who are talking about, meeting up for sex, or maybe they have, and then one of them gets upset and uses the derogatory F word toward the other, when these are both men on Grindr, right? So, I hope I explained that well enough, but that's a discussion that he and I have a lot, where he says, it's not maybe appropriate to use the word, dark underbelly, in terms of like the sex scene, here in Utah, here in Salt Lake City, but that's a repercussion of people not being good with themselves. If you're gay, it's okay. If you want to go have sex with men, that's great. Be safe and be educated, and learn about the steps of getting tested, and be honest with yourself. And while as a sex positive therapist, I always want to affirm and make a safe space for people navigating all aspects of their sexual lives, but then also acknowledging those repercussions when you hate yourself, when you cannot be honest with yourself about who you are. And so maybe your behavior is, secretive or betraying, but more specifically, getting into those DMs where you're calling somebody the FAG word and you're on Grindr. Again, just to reiterate, this is something my friend has commonly experienced, in saying, yeah, it's kind of hard to explore around here with a very large population of men who frankly hate themselves. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that in the context of, they have not been able to cross that line into healing, or into having honest conversations with a therapist or themselves about who they are and what they want. Because, going back to that conversation about a child safely masturbating, what's the big deal? What's the big deal for them to learn the parameters and the boundaries of doing that so that they can be okay? So what's the big deal with somebody navigating their sexuality, and being safe and being informed? And if they want to, be an ethical slut, we love it. Just like getting tested when they need to, or, getting on DoxyPep or whatever, just learning, getting on PrEP, learning like, okay, I'm going to be safe about this. These are my boundaries. This is what I'm going to do. But instead, and again, going back to Utah specifically, we do not have a sex positive environment here, not only to talk about testing, to talk about STIs, to talk about, safe ways of exploration. So that is something that will come up in my therapy sessions as I'm, helping somebody navigate this, helping someone navigate exploration. So whether they get on, Grindr or, Sniffies or whatever it is to navigate their needs, this is a conversation that I'm not having with women specifically, but with men, I will talk about aspects of, safety, because predominantly speaking, it is, men undergoing the sexual violence with other men in a culture of repression. So again, everybody loses when it comes to patriarchy and repression. Everybody loses. And that can be a very, very scary environment of trying to emancipate yourself, trying to figure out who you are, but you don't know if you're meeting up with someone who is healthy and good with themselves and honest with who they are. So a lot of sexual violence, a lot of sexual trauma can happen in that area of sexual exploration for men.
Yeah. So, and I hear this a lot too from like heterosexual post-Mormon women who are, in the dating scene, a lot of kind of surprising, behavior, especially if men have also left the church or seem to be progressive members, or never members, and so I think they're expecting maybe like that everybody has done this work, that everybody is kind of healthy. And but I think the work is just beginning, right? Yeah. I mean, I would say I'm still watching and catching how sexual shame shows up in my life after having educated myself so much and done so much deconstruction work and done, so much therapy around this topic for myself, it still, percolates every now and then. And I have to oh, there's that thing, and how's it impacting me, and how's it impacting my pleasure, my ability to be with somebody else, or to be non-judgmental of somebody else's sexuality, right? Or to not only be able to place my boundaries, but to be able to accept another person's boundaries. We have so many things that we just did not come equipped. I mean, boundaries in general, right? Like everything you mentioned about going into a bishop's office and having to disclose and not feeling like you had autonomy in your own privacy, it just breeds boundaries issues from a very young age, that we don't feel like we have a right to say, that's none of your business, or that's my information, I'll share it when I want, or this is the information I am comfortable sharing. I think even just listening to so many of the things that you just mentioned, I can see, a possible reaction to people being like, wait a minute, is she saying casual sex is okay? Is she saying hookup sex is okay? Is she saying just get on PrEP? Like, what is she saying? And I think we need to start with understanding that we came from a tiny little box of what was okay sexually.
Yeah.
You had to be heterosexual. You had to not have any sexual thoughts or fantasies or sexual exploration prior to committing for the rest of your life to be with one particular person. You had to really kind of pretend that you were an asexual being until you were allowed to be sexual, which, for the asexuals out there, maybe that worked for them, but that's not the majority of the population. And so even there, it doesn't really work for them either, because they're being told you have to be sexual at some point in your life. It's not, we don't honor asexuality either. So it's just such a hot mess. It's such a hot mess. So I know we're kind of coming towards the end of our time, but what are your thoughts about either healing, like somebody mentioned here, okay, what's the best way then? Patrick is saying, what's the best way to overcome sexual shaming by the LDS Church as a teenager for masturbating? How many of our LDS men and conservative religious men have been told they're sex addicts? How many people have been told, that there's something inherently wrong, diseased even, about your sexuality and how you're presenting? If you were born in a female body, how many of you were told really that you're a gatekeeper for other people's sexuality without any really thought about your own sexuality, right? Like, as a high libido person myself, I thought that there was something really wrong with me, that I kind of saw myself almost as the boys, right? Like the other girls must not like sex like I do because they're not talking to us like they talk to the girls, right? How many women are in that position where it's like, oh, if I have sexual drive, there must be something even more wrong with me because the other girls don't seem to be having this problem, which is totally ludicrous. Anyway, that's a lot for me to say, but how would you like to start talking about where do we go from here? What do we do?
Yeah, I want to start off with just one simple, affordable resource, Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff. And remember that self-compassion, this is not a buzzword. This is a really crucial step in healing, and especially in processing areas of emotional trauma. And I'm going to call shame emotional trauma because it really overtakes us. So having compassion for that kid who didn't know what he was doing, and he was doing his best, and his hormones were raging, and blue balls sucks. And we are absolutely, programmed to need to have that release. It's all normal. So on one hand, I think just understanding the concept of self-compassion and then practicing that in your life, and what that might look like, a little bit of inner child work that's pretty accessible is, maybe writing a letter to your younger self, maybe pick an age that sticks out the most in terms of when he was really going through it, when he felt really, really, really shitty about himself. Or maybe even, sometimes we draw that back to like, oh, I remember that one bishop's interview, or I remember how old I was, during that talk at state conference. We're so vulnerable when we're kids. We are so vulnerable, and we're absolutely, we don't really have that much responsibility whatsoever. So it wasn't on us. It wasn't on us to get it right. We were just doing what the adults told us to do. So to have compassion for yourself, one of the reasons I say have compassion for yourself is, I think, sometimes as adult men, there will be this tendency of looking back and feeling like, they were a bad kid, or that like, no, but I really did some bad things. And it's like, okay, we can hold space for that. And then also acknowledging that, again, with raging hormones and not knowing what to do with your body and being told like that is absolutely gross and sick and disgusting and perverted if you masturbate, which is so abusive. I'm just going to, really aggressively agree with you on that one. That is so emotionally abusive. You went through an emotionally abusive aspect of your upbringing and adolescence, which is a pretty big deal part of your childhood in terms of, your prefrontal cortex development, all these aspects of your body, your hormones developing. It's a really vulnerable time to feel so much shame. So starting with, be nice to yourself, be nice to your younger self, and absolutely consider what that might feel like, kind of parenting yourself for a minute and writing that kid a letter. Like, it's okay. You're going to get through this. And like, I'm sorry for what you're going through. And I do also want to acknowledge that being in individual therapy, and it's not just individual therapy, but finding a therapist who you feel comfortable with, that you absolutely know is not judging you, that you absolutely know is creating an environment where you are safe to say it all. You are safe to say everything that is so hard to think about, so hard to talk about. Again, just like that aspect of connection being a part of healing trauma. We are not islands. We do not thrive by ourselves. And there are aspects of community that we really, really need. And, your therapist in your community, I'm not saying that you can like go to lunch with us or anything, but, to have somebody be in your, psychological village of support. I'm never going to back down on this belief that individual therapy can be so unbelievably effective. I know we have a lot of different ways of healing and a lot of different alternative ways of healing, but I think that space with a trusted and clinically competent therapist who, again, creates an environment where it's a guarantee there's no judgment. It's a guarantee that they see you as a human going through a normal human experience. It is life-changing to repeat that process. And it's really incredible to see your life be filled with more joy and more happiness, to feel that shame lighten over time as you are able to just feel like a normal person going through a normal human experience of healing.
Yes, I so agree with all of that. I think I love that you said, shame equals emotional trauma. One of the statements I make is that sexual shame makes you sick. I think I've said it. Sexual shame is a public health crisis. If we're really going to talk about health crises, when you talk about finding a therapist, especially here in Utah, I'm concerned. I think that there are a lot of therapists functioning under their own sexual shame, under their own ideals around what sexual health should look like, instead of really understanding evidence-based principles of sexual health, which we know are things more like consent and honesty and non-coercion and mutual pleasure and shared values and protection from STIs and unwanted pregnancies. It's not so much like, oh, you're a sex addict because you went and had sex, you had some casual sex, right? Which is how some therapists will treat you. So you really do have to find somebody that is competent in sexual therapy, which I think a lot of people are not, and can do more harm and can contribute to that sexual shame instead of heal it. Yeah. So I feel strongly about that, which is why I've, founded the Mormon Mental Health Association and why I do a lot of trainings. I know, Allison, you feel very strongly about these things as well. So we're a big part of why we, I think, get along so well.
Yep, absolutely.
Around these issues. Yeah. So, and two other things I would add to what Allison is saying. I think group work can be very helpful. I run, for example, a Reclaiming Male Sexual Shame, Healing from Male Sexual Shame group. And if you're interested in that, you can definitely find it at natashahelfer.com. I know there's other people who run groups for men healing from these kinds of things. There's, of course, domestic violence groups as well to help men, and also reclaiming female sexuality, if you're in a female body. So group work can be really helpful. And I would also say practicing, I think like you start with self-compassion, you get some education, you get some good support, but I don't know that shame really goes away until we practice it out of our body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a journey, to kind of navigate your comfort zone, to identify what is all about stigma and what you are raised to see as bad and gross and immoral, and to navigate what you are comfortable with, especially in a partnership. So it's a lot. It's a lot of complexity, but in my sessions, I will often give, a few safe exposure therapy homework assignments, like going to a sex toy store, like you don't need to buy anything, you don't need to do anything, but just kind of be in that environment. They have an active business license. They are legal. It is okay. But just to be in there and look at some things. And it's okay to be a little giggly at all of the butt plugs. It's okay to be a little bit uncomfortable with all these things, but to just acknowledge like it's sex, and it's about pleasure, and it's about things that can be healthy and not awful, not traumatizing, not like we can actually put these things in the context of pleasure, which is so empowering and so beautiful. And hey, like if we're just going there for 10 minutes and browsing, that's fine. And if we get to the point that we're purchasing things, that's really cool too. I know another thing that especially some of my female clients struggle with is the conceptualization of sex positivity. Like conceptually, I'm a feminist and I want to support sex workers, and I want to like support these things that I understand as a concept are good, but also how do I stop hating porn, which, is a really common conundrum. So sometimes I'll tell my clients about Bellesa, which is, a porn website that is, first of all, not yet illegal in Utah, which is lovely, but you can still go to it. But it's owned by women. They also sell sex toys, which I think is wonderful. But to give it's still porn, but it's not based on the metrics of predominant male searches, anything involving the words stepdad or underage or things like that. It's still stuff like orgies or lesbian porn or whatever. Like it's normal pornography. But you do get the guarantee that everybody is employed and paid, and definitely an adult. I know that some other porn website companies have gotten into a lot of trouble because of things being uploaded on their website. So I always give my clients, again, that little exposure therapy homework assignment of, like exit out if you get really, really uncomfortable. But if you do want to see porn as something that can be a really healthy visualization of getting yourself to sexual stimulation and orgasm. And that's it. We're not obsessing over it. We're not like writing the porn stars and sending them fan mail or anything. This is not an obsession. It's just, something that, I think especially for ADHD individuals who often report, masturbation can be overstimulating. Like my fantasies go all over the place. And then I think about having to do the dishes after this. And then I think, I get really overstimulated. And sometimes they'll say, porn, just for that visual aspect of focus, can be something really healthy for us in terms of getting comfortable with our body, getting comfortable with masturbation. And again, we're not going into the idea that porn equals compulsivity and fixation and obsession. It's just something you're going to watch for a few minutes, and it's going to help get your mind to a more focused place for your pleasure. And that's it. You can actually keep it pretty surface level. But again, for a lot of us, this is a lot of deprogramming. This is a lot of educating. This is a lot of unlearning.
Yeah. Yeah. Or another classic one for porn is, it's always an unhealthy coping mechanism, right? It's like, no, all things can be healthy, unhealthy, from food to exercise to biting your nails.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are the ones who decide whether or not a line is crossed, and that's such a common mentality in a lot of really conservative religious cultures, this slippery slope of just one glass of wine or just one. And it's like, a lot of us have a lot to lose. We got jobs to lose. We could have custody lost. We could let's also trust ourselves in acknowledging if something starts to feel like it's going too far, I'm going to evaluate that. I'm going to reevaluate that, right? I think with this upbringing that we've been predominantly talking about, a lot of us feel like we can't trust ourselves.
Right.
And I think that's a really beautiful thing, especially in individual therapy, that we eventually navigate, like the self-determination of getting so much more connected to our bodies and trusting ourselves, trusting that we can identify what is healthy for our lives.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I could talk to you for easily another 4 hours. Mark is saying would love to hear more about the ADHD aspect. We should definitely do a program on that. ADHD and sexuality is very interesting and very complex. And I think we're oftentimes shamed immensely about how we show up with ADHD and sexuality. So that would be a great next episode to do. Allison, tell people where they can find you. What's your website? What's your contact information? If you're interested in working with Allison or understanding more what she has to offer, where can they reach out?
Sure. So you can find me on Psychology Today. My name is Allison Shiffler, Shiffler, LCSW. You can also find me on Instagram. My handle is therapy with Allison _ at the end. I used to not have the underscore, but that previous account got deactivated because I posted a lot of sex positive content. So we're just going to hope that this one lives a little longer. We'll see. Yeah. So Instagram, therapy with Allison _ at the end. And on that Instagram, you can go to the link in my profile to schedule with me. I'm actually still taking new clients. That includes individual clients and couples clients. Whenever my books fill up a little bit more into the summer, we'll close that and create a wait list. But for now, I'm still taking new clients. I also have a website, therapywithallison.com, and there are hyphens in between therapy with Allison. And that was the domain we got. It's mine. But if you're on Instagram, that's going to be the easiest way to find me, or you can find me on Psychology Today.
Perfect. And we will link to all these things as well. Okay. Show notes. And I will just say as well, we at Symmetry Counseling, we also have some openings, and we do also do work with sex therapy and training therapists to take these kinds of sex positive approaches that Allison's talking about. And you can find us at simcounseling.com as well. And please help support this podcast. If you would like to donate, we have a donate button towards that, because, there are costs that go associated with this, but for the most part, this is just my kind of loving way to offer education to the world. So I don't really make money, but it'd be nice to at least cover the website costs. So if anybody wants to throw some money at me, that'd be great for that. And Allison, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and for your frankness and your just down to earth, just very real way to talk about so many things that everybody's thinking about and dealing with. So let's heal together, people. This is exciting. It's a wonderful thing to heal. It's a wonderful thing to go into that scary cave with a flashlight and figure out how you're going to navigate it and make things that seem super scary not so scary after all. Much scarier actually to suppress things and to become leaky than to heal and encapsulate your authentic self. So thank you, Allison, for everything you have to share.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
All right. You take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. pages of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the